Hello, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Professor, where we respond to your questions about political economy, about history, about constitutional law, about the principles of a free society, even about cultural questions that pertain to how we try to live together as independent, self-reliant individuals.
All right. Now, I have a couple of people that have asked questions that are similar. So in my prerogatives as the asker of the questions, I will combine all this into one big question about the 1960 Canadian Bill of Rights. Number one, I'd like you to talk to us a little bit about the political and the cultural climate in Canada at the time that led to this Bill of Rights by Diefenbaker in 1960. And then I'll ask questions about specifically provisions about property rights that were in there once you've answered that first one.
John Diefenbaker is an odd character, a real mixed bag, but it seems to me that he had a very acute perception that there was an assault on tradition in Canada that was gathering force and that it was threatening our traditional institutions and our way of life. In fact, if you look at the Bill of Rights, among other things, it praises the family, that Diefenbaker was trying to erect defenses around institutions before they were threatened, and I admire his intuition in that regard. But the problem is that the Bill of Rights in Canada is just another law. In a parliamentary system, no parliament can bind its successor. And sometimes they try, and Diefenbaker did try. But it's not like the English Bill of Rights, which was drawn up by an extraordinary parliament at a time when the throne was vacant. And they, acting as the people assembled, created what they intended to be a second Magna Carta that was a binding condition on William and Mary taking the throne, and therefore was more than just a statute. Our Bill of Rights isn't. Now, they did insert language into it saying that any act of a subsequent parliament that conflicts with the Bill of Rights is null and void unless it expressly declares that that provision of the Bill of Rights will not operate. But although I understand the impulse, that's jiggery-pokery. Fundamentally, if a parliament passes a law and then it passes another law that conflicts with the first law, the second law prevails. It's just that simple. It has been that way since before the time of Edward Coke. And although his intentions were good, this sort of fiddling with the operation of a parliamentary system just sets a bad precedent as people stop understanding what is necessary to protect their rights. Now, the Bill of Rights only pertains to the federal government. Some people think that's a pretty bad defect. Personally, I think that's a sound piece of federalism. Unfortunately, the rest of our Constitution is not so sound federally. The central government is far too strong at the expense of the provinces. But at least in this respect, it did confine itself to placing restrictions on the federal government. The problem is they're not nearly strong enough. And this was the impulse behind the 1982 Charter, which was such a botch job that you wish that we'd just stuck with the 1960 Bill of Rights, which, among other things, did include property. But the authors of the 82 Constitution, confused as they were on most points, did realize that there was a growing problem with a parliament that was just a tame appendage of the executive and that could override liberties that were, by this point, 1,000 years old.
All right. And speaking of property rights, that's a question that several people have asked. You know, when they did the 1982 Constitution, the Charter of Rights specifically, they kind of took pretty much all the rights that were in the Bill of Rights from 1960 except property rights. Why the heck did they do that?
There were a number of reasons. One of them was simply elite distaste for the concept of people being protected against a government that knew better than they did what needed to be done. And don't forget, when you look at the past history of threats to liberty in the English-speaking world, it was not done by people who looked in the mirror and saw villains. It was done by people who looked in the mirror and saw such enlightened beings that the ignorant prejudices of the rabble must not be allowed to stand in the way of their plans. That's the same thing you got in 82. But also, among the provincial premiers, there was this conviction that they were doing just fine messing with people's property rights. And they were very afraid that the Charter of Rights, because it didn't have this, the federal government shall make no law, infringing quality that the American Bill of Rights has, but instead just decreed that rights were descending from on high in a sweet-smelling cloud, they were afraid that a great deal of provincial legislation would be invalidated and the provincial jurisdiction over property would be infringed. And so given that the Charter of Rights was being written badly, they wanted this out. But mostly it's because they wanted to mess with your life. They didn't want to have to respect your property, the fruits of your labor. They didn't want to have to pay compensation if they took away your property, either directly by seizing it or indirectly by regulation, because they thought they knew better than you did how you should be living your life. And we now are experiencing the full consequences of that conviction. And frankly, I don't think it's holding up any better now than it sounded like it was going to when they first said it. And polls did indicate that people wanted property in the Constitution. And for all his failings, Pierre Trudeau wanted it in there. I have to give him his due. He did want property rights in there, and the provinces wouldn't let him put it in. But since the Charter has that bolt hole that any right in it is only guaranteed subject to such limitations as could be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society, meaning such rights as the august members of our Supreme Court figure you'd be better off without, it wouldn't have meant anything anyway.
Now I'm all depressed. Thanks a lot. Listen, we have a plan and a project to fix the Constitution, as many of you already know. If you don't, the URL is on your screen, so go check it out. But in our new Constitution, there will be a constitutional guarantee or protection, if you will, for property rights.
Absolutely. The government will not be allowed to take property except for public use through due process with just and timely compensation, and that will include regulatory takings, and there will be no bolt hole. There will be no, unless the Supreme Court thinks it's a good idea, in which case, sayonara rights. There will be none of that on this or any other right, because in a free and democratic society, the state can't take your rights away. That really is the definition of a free society, and we are going to deliver one.
I'm kind of looking forward to that draft. We're going to share it soon, right? This year, sometime later?
As the documentary is ready, the draft will be ready. We have a plan in place, not just a series of complaints, valid as they are, not just an analysis of what needs to be done. We are producing a plan for fixing it. It's a bold plan, it's an ambitious plan, but it is a practical plan, and we do hope we will have your support when it is ready.
All right. Well, thanks for that, folks. If you would like to play along and ask your question of the professor, the URL on your screen will take you to the page where everything is explained. Thank you, and see you next time.